And then if you feel like turning it off, turn it off. When in doubt, turn it on. Other than that, I'll give an intro. You guys can go, and then I'm happy to run my for questions.
Great.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the People's Forum. We are a political education center that uplifts working class movements all over the world. In fact, this week we have a class coming up on the Indonesian struggle, and we have movie screenings every Thursday. This week, actually, I'll be doing a screening of Len. Tomorrow we have a screening of The East, but it happens every Thursday. We also have art classes, workshops, everything from fashion shows to concerts. It really goes all over the place, but all to kind of foster this idea of building political education in all of its facets, in music, in dance, in, of course, books, and everything you can imagine. So we invite you to join us if you haven't been here before. And we also know that history is often told as a tale of individuals who lead the charge in their struggles, of heroes, of legends, but without minimizing the impact of those iconic people, it's fair to say that this kind of historic record often leaves so many stories untold. There are stories that are more intimate, but no less significant to the impact that they had. We know that history is the movement of everyday people, of the masses, all with their own experiences and perspectives to share, and their own reasons for wanting to build a better world. And that's why we're excited to host the book launch of Stayed on Freedom, The Long History of Black Power Through One Family's Journey. Stayed on Freedom endeavors to be a new history of Black liberation, told through the intertwined stories of two grassroots organizers, Zoharah Simmons and Michael Simmons, who dedicated their lives to the fight for freedom. And their commitment to each other and to social change took them on a decades-long journey that traversed first the country and then the world. And we're honored to be joined by the author of the book, Dan Berger, who is a historian, professor, and abolitionist. He curates the Washington Prison History Project and is the author of tonight's book. Yes, feel free to give a warm welcome. We're also honored to have Michael Simmons, of course, one of the subjects of today's book. And he has been a domestic and international human rights activist for 60 years, beginning as an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and later as director of European programs for the American Friends Service Committee. And Michael's work has taken him all over the world to many different continents. We're also excited to be joined by Nia T. Evans, who is a freelance writer and editor based in New York City. She writes about Black life, politics, and culture, and her writing has appeared in Teen Vogue, Hammer and Hope, Slate, The Hill, Education Post, Boston Review, and many other places. We encourage you to buy the book, of course, at 1804 Books or wherever else you can find books. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us, to both you, and everyone online. Thank you.
Let you take it away.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So my name is Nia Evans. I'm really excited to facilitate this conversation about Stayed on Freedom. I am coming to this work as a writer and editor, but who really got their start in education and youth justice organizing. So reading this book, right, thinking about Michael and Zoharah and their journey to each other and their journey to really Black liberation work over decades. It started when they were young, right? It started in their early lives. So I think I want to ground this conversation by talking a little bit about young people in the freedom struggle and the role that they play. And Michael, I'll start with you. Can you talk a little bit about your earliest experiences as an organizer and what role you see both past, present, and future of young people in the struggle? And then Dan, I want to hear your thoughts as well.
Excuse me. Well, thank you all for coming out. Really flattered, and hopefully it'll be worth your time. That, like, I see young people as essential, which is not to minimize old folks like myself, but it is to say that young people bring a dynamism beyond energy, but just intellectual creativity that I think all folks my age need to be engaged with. One thing I always tell people, there are some people my age, and particularly in the African American community, but in others, who revere the status of senior citizens, and that I think that that though when it comes to politics, we have to moderate that some, in the sense that clearly I have some things to offer people based on my experiences, but I also don't use Twitter, don't use Instagram, don't use TikTok, don't do a lot of things and that are necessary in a technological age. And I always say that each generation will come up with strategies and tactics that the previous generation thinks are absurd. The example that I like to give on that is, for young people may not appreciate it as much as others, but if you can imagine a group of young people going into Mississippi in 1960 and say, look, we're going to take a bus from Washington to D.C., we're going to integrate it, and we're going to ride to Jackson, Mississippi, and we're going to keep it integrated throughout the whole process. Well, to people from Mississippi, that sounded like madness. It sounded like absurdity. You could take the sit-in movement and say, a group of young people say, look, we're going to go into this restaurant and we're going to sit here until we get served. No matter what happens to us, we're not going to move. Well, people from that community saw that as a death sentence, but yet people did it and it worked. So that I say that to say that there are all sorts of things that young people today will come up with that people my age had no idea about, let alone don't think it can happen. And even if it fails, it creates opportunities for people to learn through the generations. So I see young people as fundamental to the future in terms of social change.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that, and I think I feel very fortunate to have met before Michael Zoharah Simmons, his partner, his ex-partner, co-parent, lifelong friend and comrade, as a young person, as a young activist. And I think for me, as a young person wanting to figure out some sense of political strategy and organizing, I was really drawn to history. And so to me, I wanted to learn from what a previous generation or what previous generations of organizers did. And the most immediate precursor to growing up in the 90s of political activism was in the 60s. And sort of trying to see what did young people in the 60s do. And I feel, I learned a lot from reading books and as I got older from doing archival research. But I also was really grateful to learn from movement veterans who were young in the 60s and 70s and who I could now interact with as movement elders, right? So the first set of folks for whom that was true for me were political prisoners who were incarcerated. And I started writing people not initially having no knowledge or real interest in prison itself, but just here were people who had been young organizers in the 60s and 70s that I knew how to contact, right? Because all the old people around me seemed terrible as a young person. And so for me, it was just about having that contact. But when I went to college and at the University of Florida and started the same year that Zoharah Simmons started there as a professor, it was the first person I met face-to-face who had been a young person in the 60s and who was still involved, right? And I think that sense of kind of intergenerational struggle and learning was so important to me and remains so important to me. I agree with Michael entirely around people have different set of risks and capabilities based on age, among other factors. And I feel like a lot of writing this book for me was being a parent and an older, getting older and trying to figure out my own place in movement, right? Where some of the things that I may have done or been part of in the past are differently possible or not possible in the same way. And so for me, there's a lot about this that is, how can we think through intergenerational political organizing and what are the different possibilities and limitations that greet us at these different phases of our lives.
On that point of intergenerational organizing, which as someone who came up through the Black Youth Project 100, which is an incredible member-based sort of Black millennial direct action group that came out of really the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012, I found them in DC, and I would say like 2017. And right, Kathy Cohen brought that space together. BYP 100, Dream Defenders, you have all of these amazing sort of groups that have come out of the last 10 years that are doing really creative work that in part exist because of the work. Not only is their struggle and their strategies and the sort of political traditions that they're drawing on connected to a longer legacy, you also had a lot of the people who came out of that work say, we're gonna help a new generation create space. So I wanna come back to that point of intergenerational organizing because I think it's crucial. But I also want to start with the genesis of this project. I got excited. I jumped the gun because I've read this book and I had a great time with it. But for folks who have not read this book, can you, Dan, tell me what the genesis of this was and how did Black Power become sort of the unifying thread of this project?
Yeah, so the project is a biography of Michael and of Zoharah. As I mentioned, Zoharah was my teacher in the classroom, but also was a mentor and advisor to a lot of the campus activism I was doing as an undergrad. And then when I graduated and I moved to Philadelphia and I met Michael soon thereafter, I was and remain impressed by both of them for a variety of reasons, including that a lot of their stories had not yet been captured by our sense of history. And Black Power really illuminates that, right? Because when I first met Zoharah, Black Power was the villain of the civil rights story. And now we have a great celebration of Black Power, but mostly from other phases of the movement. You know, the Panthers sort of loom large in our sense of Black Power, rightly so. But it's still a story that focuses on the late 60s, early 70s in a pretty narrow sense. And I think one of the things that so impressed me about Michael and Zoharah is, the trajectory of becoming activists, becoming organizers, of really sort of fighting and organizing at the sort of heyday of movement, but then also continuing to do that. And how do you continue? How do you keep going after, the kind of radical or revolutionary changes that seem on the precipice actually reveal themselves to be much further away? And so the book sort of follows them as they become engaged in politics, right, from very different starting points. Michael in Philadelphia, Zoharah in Memphis, Tennessee. And the ways that they meet in the movement, right, through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, but also the variety of global adventures that they have. And I think that sense of continuity and of ever-expanding set of commitments and ever-expanding set of questions that I think a life on the left requires, comes through so strongly in their story. And I wanted to be able to sort of tell a story of Black Power from its origins within the civil rights movement, how it expanded the civil rights movement, and how it articulated a new set of political connections and coalitions and what did that require on a human level? What did that look like to actually go through that and to try and fail and try again?
Yeah, I think the human level is one of the things that makes this book so wonderful. And Michael, can you talk about what it was like to be a part of Black consciousness raising, what it was like to sort of help create that framework, how you applied it in your political work, and how it has shaped the trajectory of your life?
Excuse me. Yes. Where to start there? Even though I have along the way adopted various ideologies in my life, by and large, that like I've been a pragmatist and trying to take it step by step, the next step. And to that degree, that was the evolution, both individually and I would argue collectively, of the group that I was a part of within SNCC called the Atlanta Project, in the sense that all of us were veterans of various other struggles within SNCC before we came together in Atlanta. And we came together in Atlanta to support Julian Bond, not unlike what we're seeing in Nashville right now, by the way. But that's it. But I digress to go into that. But the point that I'm making is that the one thing we began to realize from various parts of the organizing experience was a commonality amongst the folks that we were organizing as it related to how they related to us, the outsiders in their community, which in many cases was interracial. One of the dimensions that we realized was that the African American community in places like Mississippi or Arkansas and all saw the support of white people in a entirely different way than they saw a northerner from, say, Philadelphia, like myself. So that there was almost there was a deference to the white people. And it was not an appreciation, but a deference. And that they still saw them as being intellectually superior, just to be frank about it. That and then you have to keep in mind also that I grew up in an era where African Americans talked about good hair and bad hair. We talked that I had a friend whose mother used to pinch his nose when this little boy, trying to make it pointier. That I remember when skin bleaching was one of the highest items sold in the African American community. So I grew up in that environment where someone would say, well, she's black, but she still's kind of cute. I mean, that people weren't ashamed to say things like that. So in that context, we began to see that the people that we were working with were extremely deferential to our white colleagues. It was not the white colleagues' fault, I might add, although some appreciated it more than others, but nevertheless, but it wasn't their fault. So that, and then I began to, the way that I would formulate it now is that the process of liberation is as important as being liberated. And so that the things that we all struggle for are not just material things, but a change in the psychic behavior of whomever we're struggling with. And that in the context of Black Power, that we began to see that at that point in the lives of African Americans, that it was impossible not to just break yourself free of those bonds without breaking yourself free of those bonds. So that in that regard, we suggested that African Americans need to organize African Americans and that whites need to be organizing whites as we come together, not as we separate. And so that in a simplistic way, that was one of the fundamental origins of the development of what has become known as Black Power.
Thank you. I want to turn us into more of a conversation. Can we talk about the Atlanta Project for a minute? Because I was reminded of that line, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Because, right, you have this Atlanta Project in SNCC where you have a ton of young people, yes, being pulled from some of the local HBCUs, but also coming from all over the country to really challenge Jim Crow, the apartheid state, right? Like whatever you want to call it, to really advance Black liberation. And then you have these Black Atlanta elites putting every barrier in the way. So in this book, I really enjoyed, hearing about the Spelman president who at the time was furious at the idea that there were Spelman students who were joining SNCC, who were attending church with, important ministers and preachers who were thinking about sort of Black liberation theology. And as I was reading this book, right, I was thinking about Cop City. So right now you have this really important political struggle happening where there's a really sort of hodgepodge coalition of, you have environmental activists, you have abolitionists, you have folks from sort of various sort of like leftist orientations who are challenging the construction of this $80 million plus police training facility that will essentially give cops from across the country and in Atlanta more tools to kill, more tools to surveil, more tools to oppress communities. And you see the Atlanta power structure, right? That is Black. Not only putting down barriers, but charging people with domestic terrorism, using the full power of the state to oppress and to crush this struggle. And so I want to hear both of you reflect a little bit about, I think it's not just about Atlanta. There's a real story about what political struggle looks like with intra-racially, what it looks like for Black folks and even multiracial coalitions, because Cop City is multiracial, what it looks like for there to be struggles between sort of like Black elite structures, corporations, media, and Black folk on the ground in coalition with larger groups. And to me, the SNCC Atlanta project was just this perfect encapsulation of, it's not the same, but it calls on very similar tactics. So I'm curious to hear you both talk a little bit about what you learned in your research, Michael, what you experienced on the ground in Atlanta, and how you see the sort of lessons of the SNCC Atlanta project in today's movement landscape.
That's a lot, but let me and parenthetically, by the way, I spent 2 months in jail in Atlanta at the place that they're now calling Cop City. There used to be a kind of a stockade kind of thing for the minimum security, I guess, our prisoners. That's just, I just mentioned that because when I see it, it just brings back memories to me. But I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
How do you see the echoes of the Atlanta project today? What was your experience sort of struggling against a Black elite power structure?
Well, Atlanta is no different really than any other of the places in the country as it relates to the elites. I always say that in general, one of the difficulties of organizing oppressed, marginalized people is that people find a way to adopt to their oppression just to get through the day. You can't fight every day. So that people say, look, you come in offering a different vision, and their view is, well, what you're saying is good, but I know how this works. I'm used to this. I know it ain't great, but it beats the unknown. And that in that context, the unknown, the people who help to keep your life going are the elites. They become the arbiters between the oppressor and the oppressed. And in every community that like I ever went into in the South, there were certain almost categories. It would be a funeral director was one of the elites. A particular minister, school teachers. They were all the ones who moderated the Black-white reality. And so that, like, to us, the idea is to break that and to get people to see that, particularly African Americans and other people of color, that while clearly that the race color issue plays a big role, that it transcends that. And that many other, in fact, I always tell people during the civil rights movement, I am sure that I had more intense arguments with African Americans than I did with white people, because we had to break through that elite status that the community gave the educated. So that to that degree, it doesn't surprise me what's going on in Atlanta. It doesn't surprise me what happened in Memphis a month or so ago with the police beating the young man whose name escapes me right now. But it doesn't surprise me because that's all part of the culture, as far as I'm concerned. That's all the way that the society is structured, and that we, people of color, undermine our movement if we just see it in the context of people who look like us, because the struggle clearly is about those who are oppressed and those who are not, and sometimes they look like us and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, right? And I think the Atlanta project was a particular project of SNCC where that became kind of an incubator for a lot of these kind of conversations those conversations had been happening in more sort of diffuse and decentralized ways. So, in the book, it talks about Zoharah, who became one of the only women project directors of Mississippi Freedom Summer, which was not planned, right? But the planned project director got run out of the state. And her attempts to try to rent a space for an office were stymied because there were very few, the few Black landlords didn't want to, were scared of the movement, right? And they were scared of the terrorism that movement would embrace. But those who did, at least one of those who rented to the Laurel Project was charged this exorbitant rate, right? And didn't want to do it. And but if he was going to do it, he was going to make a lot of money off from it. And so I think, right, both Michael and Zoharah in different interviews sort of said a version of what Michael said, right? That there were these that they had to fight against sort of elite Black people in different ways. And Atlanta is, the biggest city in the South at that time that had the biggest Black elite in the South. And I think the fights of the Atlanta Project are certainly remembered most in terms of Black power and the relationship to white people. But there are several stories in the book about disagreements and fights with Black political elites in the city. Martin Luther King Sr., right? So
hitting Michael with his cane, and
right.
MLK's daddy hitting you with his cane.
Yeah, and that state senator whose name was J.D. Hood, right? Who tried to, assist in getting you sort of thrown out of this politician's office, only to find himself, the police called on him, right? Right. And so, I think this is where the kind of, class critique of sort of social movement is so essential. One thing I really appreciate about the Atlanta Project, which, Michael alluded to this earlier, but formed to re-elect Julian Bond, because Julian Bond had been elected to the Georgia State Legislature, and before he could take a seat, he was kicked out of the legislature because SNCC released a statement against the war in Vietnam and against U.S. imperialism more broadly, and because he was a member of SNCC, he was sort of tarred and feathered with that statement and prevented from taking a seat. And so the Atlanta Project formed to re-elect Julian Bond, but it also was organizing tenants and workers throughout Atlanta. But if you look at most books about Atlanta or about SNCC, they are the bad guys of the story, and they are the villains of the story. And I think that one of the things I really appreciate about the Atlanta Project is the creation of this document called the Black Consciousness Paper that came out of reflections, that came out of conversations that members of the project had, after sort of long days of doing rent strikes and tenant strikes, of trying to sort of keep people from being evicted, of printing out flyers and to pass out to women as they took the buses out to the fancy white houses to work as domestics. They would talk about what they had learned over the last several years of organizing in Atlanta, in Mississippi, and elsewhere. And I think that sense of reflection is a lot of what Michael is talking about in terms of accommodation to oppression and the need for Black power and the need for Black people to see themselves in positions of power and leadership, and the need for white people to organize white people against racism. And I think that sense of a kind of reflexivity, right, that sense of reflection while you're organizing, is one that we don't often take seriously enough as organizers, right? Or in the context of a conversation about organizing, it's just, well, you're just out there all the time. But no, you're out there, but you also have to reflect on what's working, what isn't working, what are the barriers that you need to overcome. And I think the Atlanta Project had this very sort of reflexive component that is the birth of Black Power, is the basis of Black Power.
So I'm realizing I don't actually know how much time we have. So whoever is in charge, feel free to tell me to stop at any moment. But there was a point that really hit me in the book that I want to hear both of you reflect on. So Michael, so much of your work, you've been doing human rights work for decades. And at one point you're doing anti-apartheid work within sort of a Quaker organization. And Dan, you write that there was some struggle around some of the leaders of this organization or even your allies objecting to resistors of this apartheid order employing violence in any type of way. And Dan, you wrote that Michael had to do a lot of work to clarify the nature of violence. And that really hit me because I think so much of, especially abolitionist organizing, is getting people to understand or rethink the way we understand violence. So can you both talk a little bit about, Michael, your work of clarifying the nature of violence across your career and also today? And Dan, what it was like to do that research and how you understand that point?
Well, it offends me profound to say I clarified the nature of violence, but I mean, let me start there. But that I think that when we look at the movements of oppressed peoples throughout in any environment, when their movements have violence in them, say there's a Black Lives Matter protest and some people break windows or whatever, that violence is captured by the media as independent of what initiated it. So it is not to apologize for that rage, although I'd say oppressed people have a right to get angry and pissed off. But that rage begins to supersede what led to the movement in the first place. So the things that we were trying to say during in particular, anti-apartheid work, as well as work with other oppressed peoples in any environment, is that that fundamentally social movements have been nonviolent. That fundamentally social movements have attempted to resolve the issues in a nonviolent manner. If you look at the history of the African National Congress, they weren't always an armed liberation movement. It wasn't until the Sharpeville massacre in 1962 that they decided to shoot back, if you will. But even in that context, there was so many nonviolent activities going on, so that it wasn't like they stopped being nonviolent, but violence became an aspect of their struggle. So that our view to people who were pacifists was like, okay, let us support the nonviolent aspects. Let us support the medical aspect of the liberation movements. Let us support the schools that liberation movements were doing, so that because one aspect of that movement is violent, does not mean that the entire movement should be written off as violent.
Yeah, it was really wonderful to do. The book is based on lots of interviews with Michael and Zoharah and others, but also on a lot of archival work. And so for this section of the book, I was going through a lot of the archives at the American Friends Service Committee and seeing these very fierce debates. And in my mind, the whole time was Palestine today, right? And the ways that people talk about violence and where violence is coming from or where violence is located. Because you, as Michael was saying, you had a lot of, and as your question assumes, right, you have a lot of Quakers who were responding to armed struggle as the only place where violence existed in apartheid, right? And the movement response was, well, this whole system is violent, and to focus on the violent violent tactics of some oppressed people is to miss the structural relationship of violence that defines the whole thing, right? The whole thing is violence. So how can we start there? And someone who I interviewed for the book sort of said that we said we didn't have the language of structural violence, but that's what we were trying to name, right? that violence is the origins of it. Violence is the basis of it. But it was really profound to see a number of debates. It was both about the use of armed struggle and whether, for the Quakers, although this debate was playing out in other faith-based organizations as well, whether they could support anything, right, involving anti-apartheid, because if there's any violence involved. But there was also those debates about divestment, right? That part of the work that Michael and others were doing was about divesting from U.S. corporations doing work in South Africa. And you saw the same response then that you see now when people talk about divesting from Israel, that, singling out, but also if you divest, that's going to hurt the ordinary Black South Africans who work in these companies, right? Or that's going to hurt the Palestinians who work in these factories in West Bank or Gaza or so on. So to me, it's a perfect illustration of what you were saying earlier about history not repeating but rhyming. And so that section of the book is trying to tell a very important story of the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s, a kind of earlier phase than we often talk about. But also it's very pointed. Right? I hope as you read it that you are thinking a lot about Palestine, because that was very present in my mind in writing it.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I have one more question and then we're going to open it up, so folks should feel free to think of questions. But what do you both hope people take away from this book, this 6-year-long project that recounts a good chunk of your life, Michael?
Well, there are a few things. That there's one of my favorite songs from the civil rights movement is "Freedom is a constant struggle," and clearly, if there's anything, this book represents that in terms of Zoharah in mind. And let me just step back. Even though geography, etc., but Zoharah is such an important part of this book, and and in many ways, we don't compare things, but like her personal story is a dynamic one of growing up in Memphis, Tennessee in the 60s and 50s, in terms of the apartheid system, being an African-American a woman, even in an African-American civil rights organization, having to fight through sexism under circumstances where the people who where you're living, the white people are trying to literally assassinate you, and on and on and on. In terms of Zoharah's struggle, and neither one of us can capture it, but I do want to speak up for it, because this gathering would be fundamentally different if Zoharah was here. So I just want to say that as my friend and comrade. But in terms of me and the book, that I want young people to see that there's always something you can do. You don't have to necessarily devote your entire life to certain things, as I tried to do. But in any situation, when people say, well, what should I do? I say, start where you're at. In your street, in your neighborhood, in your school, in your job, somebody's getting ripped off, unless you're awfully lucky. So start there, because that's where I started. I didn't start thinking about nuclear weapons or the environment or women's issues or gay and I didn't start there. Started in a very narrow context in terms of my own political development. So that's one thing that I really hope people get out of it. The other thing, and I was talking to my wife Linda about this, I said, I hope the one day we are used bookstore aficionados. We know bookstores all over the U.S., having driven That I said, the one day I hope that some person in some community, a marginalized person, runs across this book in a book bin and becomes inspired to do the work of social change. I mean, if just one person did that, I personally would feel it was all worth it.
That's such a lovely sentiment. I hate to ruin it by speaking, but I'll just add, as you'll see in the book, or those of you who have read it already have seen, Michael was involved with lots of sort of Marxist efforts. Zoharah was involved with lots of Black nationalist efforts. These are things that are often treated as separately, but actually really coexist, right? They're in conversation with each other. I think the different threads, different dimensions of the Black freedom struggle, which is to say of the universal freedom struggle, are often treated separately. And I think, to me, part of why this book needed to be a biography of both of them, right, is that within one family, you see all these issues come together. Right? You see all these, heady intellectual issues, but also all of these just heartfelt, urgent human issues of what it means to fight for freedom and justice and liberation be together. And too often our stories of struggle are divided and separate. So we're looking only at this particular place, or we're looking only at this particular philosophy, or only at this particular kind of strategy. And I think part of why we do that is that we often tell the story of struggle through particular organizations or particularly famous leaders, typically male leaders. But most social change is made by people that you've never heard of. And so to me, I want to write a book of people who I know very well, but who you haven't heard of, right? Sort of quote unquote. So, if the book only serves to make Michael and Zoharah more famous, it will have been a failure. Although apparently my son said that that he knows I know famous people like Michael Simmons, but do I know other famous people also? So maybe it's already been a success at that. But I really think my hope, right, is that it can help shift our focus on the story of movements and the practice of movements away from just these celebrated figures and these celebrated moments to being the lifelong human journey that it is, and a lifelong human journey that is made by all of us.
Okay, we have to give it up for that. That was the perfect way to end. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Okay, anyone have a question? We have a microphone if you would like one.
Oh, shucks. I didn't think you would actually pick me. This has been a great event and great thoughts. One thing that is in the book that didn't come up, which I think Dan kind of alluded to it just now, is, Michael, I want to ask you about your anti-capitalist philosophy, that you were involved in the new communist movement and you spent time in Hungary, having been fairly familiar with the USSR. And you can talk about Eastern Europe, but I'm interested about how your anti-capitalist philosophy worked with your organizing for Black Power.
Well, actually, I mean that to some degree, my first introduction to ideology was communism. My first intellectual mentor was a African American communist who owned a bookstore in Philadelphia, and the way he started the bookstore was during the McCarthy period. His comrades were throwing away their books, and that he started collecting them, and he opened up this bookstore. And as fate would have it, one day, because I was literally looking for books on African American history, not communism, just African American history, anything at that, back before there was a section in bookstores, and I just wandered into his bookstore one day, And I can't say he changed he intellectually, he clearly changed my life because he introduced me to, I'd heard about Paul Robeson as a singer, but not as an activist. I knew the name W.B. Du Bois, but had no reference. He talked about the time when Paul Robeson, they tried to assassinate him in Peekskill, New York, for an example. And he would give me the books on the Negro National Question by this African-American communist, Harry Haywood. And so that kind of started me off. But in general, it's not complicated to see that capitalism rips people off. At least it wasn't for me. And that my saving grace, I think, was that I really had no material or financial goals in my life. My only thing was trying to improve the environment in which I was in or other people's environment. I was not trying to get a job. I was not trying to become anything. That I was doing what I wanted to do. So to me, it wasn't complicated. Now, I'm not suggesting that people who want some material things are bad people. Let me be clear. That and I think that people make choices throughout their life. I do criticize people who are willing to obtain these things on other people's backs. But in terms of my own intellectual and emotional, really, stability, there's no way that I could be anything other than anti-capitalist when I see what capitalism has done to people.
Do we have time for one more? Or? Okay, we've got time for one more. And if no one does, I've got one more. Okay.
I also want to say at least Zoharah's in the chat. She says hello.
Yay. I'll ask one more question because I think it's relevant to a lot of the incredible movement work that's happening today. And it's about experimentation. Because I think if you are not organizing in your daily life, if you're not studying movements, the idea of experimentation might feel really scary. So if I were to tell my grandma, which I have sometimes, that I don't believe in police or prison, she says, well, then what are you going to do? How are you going to keep people safe? What are you going to do? And I spent a lot of time trying to explain that the way we get to freedom involves a lot of experimentation. And I'm curious because to a certain extent, the manifesto that you drafted in Atlanta, that was an experiment. That wasn't we have necessarily the power, we have the sanctified power to be able to say, now we are going to be using a Black consciousness framework. You took a risk. You decided to try something, and it made a big difference. So I guess for folks who are not organizing in their daily lives, can you talk about what experimentation brings and what it can give us? When I look at the carceral state, let's say, and that as a result of my draft resistance, I spent 2.5 years in jail. During that time, up at the Lewisburg complex in Pennsylvania. During that time, I'll make a long story short, I was able to gather inmates to write a play called Mirror on Lennox Avenue, which was really a challenge to my fellow inmates about what got them in there in terms of, because most as far as I'm concerned, so-called criminals are predators on their own community. It's not like they're going out and to other communities. And so so after the play was written, we performed it inside the prison at Allenwood Prison. And some professors from Bucknell University, which is right near there, saw it and arranged for us to perform it at the campus while we were in jail. So what started off as having a play with 15 speaking parts went up to 30-some speaking parts. I just trying to get as many people out of the jail for a night as possible. Now, in the process of that experience, the amount of talent that emerged from my fellow inmates, some people that I used to view as, oh, this guy's a knucklehead, drew some of the
the beautiful sets you'd ever seen in terms of the Manhattan skyline. Some of the acting, and it was a satirical, so it wasn't a drama, but nevertheless, I mean, but the acting that people engaged in was so dramatic, and so for many of the people, most of the people were barely high school, in some cases barely junior high school graduates. Okay, so I'm almost certain nobody who was involved with it had ever been on a college campus, particularly for anything positive. So that, and I say to myself now, in retrospect, because I didn't think about this then, suppose I had theater groups in jail, just as an example. Or I look at the people in jail, friends of mine, who again, high school dropouts, told they were incorrigible, etc., started writing poetry in jail, started writing novels in jail, started carving. And then I say, well, you mean to tell me no teacher could see this talent? Because all children do dumb stuff in school. But when you just get labeled by the worst thing you ever did and are not encouraged by your positive attributes, then it creates a static situation. So that I think that the experimental, that there's so many things that people could be doing with folks that would allow people to find their place in the world. And so that to that degree, I support creative thinking on these things. And you got to be willing to fail. It's true. That's the other thing. People always put on us perfection. They just joke people around, kill people, take their health care, et cetera, but we have to be perfect. And no, we're struggling with no resources. So that I think that it's a necessity, frankly. It's not even an option. It's a necessity.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely, right? And I think we could think about experimentation on these different scales, right? So the Zoharah's first kind of overtly political action was an unplanned experiment when she went to downtown Memphis when she was still in high school to apply for a job and was turned away in all these places, right? Even though she had the skills to be, a typist, all these things that, women were trained jobs that women were trained for at that time, but turned away because they were racist and she's Black. And so when she goes to take the bus back to her house, she just, without thinking, sits in the front seat. So not trying to do a protest, but all of a sudden she's being threatened and harassed, and she stays in that seat, and she stays in that sit-in, and that that was her first sort of political step, right? That sort of the book then follows the next 60 years. Right. So I think there are all kinds of experiments that we do individually just in our own political lives that bring us into action, that keep us involved in different ways. And then I think the world we're trying to build is one that hasn't existed yet, right? So we're not trying to go back to some sort of golden past. We're trying to do something better and different than what's been done. And so to me, right, the sense of experimentation is the basis of it all, right? And in a lot of ways, it's the method to get there too.
Well said. Thank you both again for this book, for this talk, for sharing your wisdom. And thank you, People's Forum and everyone who organized this event for making it possible.
Yeah, thank you.
Big round of applause. All right. Thanks, everyone. Go buy the book. It's at the front. Go buy the book. It's a wonderful book. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming.